My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte, and I am very happy to welcome everyone today to actually our first event of the year. This is a series on ethics and pain management, which is sponsored by NC Biotech. And we have Jada Wiggleton-Little today. She came to our MA program for a while, then she did a PhD at UCSD, is currently a fellow in neuroethics at the Cleveland Clinic, and will be starting in the philosophy department at Ohio State in the fall. So this is all absolutely super, and I'm really, really excited to welcome her here today. I will first tell you that there will be at least 2 more talks in this series. They'll probably both be in the spring, so look for announcements on that. We're also doing a series on medical humanities here, so be on the lookout for those. There will be some, I think, obvious crossover interest between pain management and medical humanities. So now I don't want to take any more of your time, so I'll give it to Jada.
Thank you. Just confirming that I'm all mic'd up and audible. And I'm gonna thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to those who are on the Zoom. As mentioned, this is kind of a bit of a homecoming, so definitely grateful and nostalgic to be back. So in our time, I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on for the last year or two. I've always kind of been interested in the phenomenon of pain dismissal, but really started to question the limits of epistemic injustice when we kind of talk about this phenomenon in the clinic. Next slide, please. So kind of for context, for those who may not be familiar with the terminology, epistemic injustice was a concept developed by Miranda Fricker in 2007, and it's really looking at a class of distinct wrongings of someone in their capacity as an epistemic subject. And so for her, she says one of the main things that we as humans are able to do is to share information and share knowledge. And so it's a wronging in a person's capacity to share knowledge with others, to be a part of this knowledge production. But when we're talking about pain dismissal become a very hot topic in the last few years. A lot of news articles have been looking at how women, people of color, anyone from a marginalized identity, this experience of having their pain dismissed. And so often you hear pain sufferers in the media or in their testimonies report feeling as if they were dismissed as complainers, drug seeking, told that it's just anxiety, you're fine, that it's all in your head. And when bioethicists are kind of grappling with this phenomenon, when they're trying to explain this common form of pain dismissal, they consider an act of testimonial injustice. So testimonial injustice is a kind of epistemic injustice. It's a wronging in a person's capacity, again, to share information through testimony. We'll kind of unpack this definition a bit more, but it's really the hearer's prejudice against an identity. So whether they're prejudiced against the person's gender identity, racial identity, that allows them to unfairly question the person's pain reports, right? Cause them to unfairly kind of discredit the information that they're providing. Another form of epistemic injustice Miranda Fricker talks about is this language of a hermeneutical injustice. So bioethicists Carol and Kidd has also talked about in our healthcare setting, in our clinic, that there's really this overvalue of the objective information. Like we love the images, we love blood draws, right? We want very clear impersonal information about a condition. And in fact, in the recent years, I believe this article even just came out a couple of months ago, scientists are feeling like they're very close to identifying an objective measure to pain. And so there will be kind of these brain signals that we can look at, and it will let us know whether or not someone's experiencing a chronic pain. And so why is that a problem? Well, as long as healthcare practices are privileging this objective third-person information, they tend to underprivilege or have an unfair advantage to those who are sharing first personal information. So whenever a patient comes in and kind of just sharing how they feel, like I had a headache yesterday, it felt throbby, that's now getting unfairly discredited compared to the objective images. And for this reason, bioethicists are considering that an act of hermeneutical injustice. So hermeneutical injustice looks at how our culture, how our structure functions such a way that certain people can't contribute to this knowledge, right? That their experiences becomes unintelligible, we can't make sense of it. So just in virtue of the identity of being a pain sufferer, the identity of having chronic pain, you're automatically at this disadvantage of sharing your reports with a clinician because of this privileging of objective information. And I think, yes, we talk a lot about pain dismissal in terms of doubting people's pains, in terms of discrediting pain sufferers, of denying that their pains even exist. But I don't think that's the only kind of pain dismissal that's out there. Sometimes we have pain dismissals where it just seems like we don't really care about the person's pain experience. In more philosophical language, it's like we're not as motivated by that pain. And I think also we have these forms of pain dismissal that's not about my identity. So it's not necessarily because I speak as a cisgender Black woman that you find my pain report difficult to accept, but it's sometimes about the kinds of pains that we experience. And so the case I want to focus on in this talk is looking at the case of menstrual pains. So this vignette was actually taken from a Medical News Today article, Endometriosis Experiences, the Long Painful Road to Diagnosis. And the person who's talking is Alma. Alma started experiencing excruciating menstrual pains as early as the age of 14, went to a number of gynecologists. And as you can see in the vignette, she was offered no treatment apart from the very strong pills, many of which have been discontinued due to the dangerous side effects. Mostly she was just told to deal with it. Everyone just assumed that it was just a painful period. Nobody seemed to think it was a condition. Nobody regarded it as something that was even worthy of treatment. She's seen a lot of gynecologists in her life, particularly in her teens and early 20s. It was just assumed that it was a normal, albeit very painful period, despite the fact that she would have pain and vomit to the point of fainting and experiencing hallucinations, right? And so it wasn't until, again, she started having these intense menstrual cramps at the age of 14. She didn't get the official diagnosis of endometriosis until the age of 30. And so there's important features of this case I want us to kind of keep in the forefront of our minds as we're engaging in this conversation, right? So the first thing that happened is that Alma communicated her pain with physicians, right? It's not that she was just expressing it. It wasn't a reflex, that she was intentionally trying to share her pain with her gynecologist. When she was sharing this pain, given the gynecologist's responses, they believed, or at least responded in a way that they believed her pain exists. And which kind of gives this impression that they perceived Alma and her utterance to be credible information, right? They took her as genuinely sharing information and they accepted the information shared. Yes, you are in pain. Another aspect of the story I left out, again, to reiterate the belief of the pain, but the lack of action. At some point, she went to a family doctor. Her, again, menstrual pains were so bad. And she was like, can I get a doctor's note? Like, I can't go to work. And the clinician was like, a doctor's note for period pain? A doctor's note. Like the idea of being excused from common everyday activities due to a menstrual pain was just so inconceivable. But again, in that response, he didn't deny that she was in pain. He didn't say, I don't believe you, or called it something else. So there's some kind of acknowledgement there. So again, despite believing that Alma is in pain, that Alma does have menstrual pain, the physicians that she interacted with, I'm going to show, were improperly motivated by Alma's utterance, right? So if we think again about what she was describing, they didn't really consider any other diagnostic. They didn't do any kind of advanced options of treatment other than the pills she received. The brief story I just shared, the doctor was like, a doctor's note, like refused to write a doctor's note for this pain. So they weren't kind of moved to these actions that indicate that they were alarmed, that they're concerned, that they're really taking seriously the pain that she's sharing. And then lastly, it's important for us to acknowledge that in Alma's case, that this failure to be motivated, despite being believed, despite arguably being seen as a credible reporter of her pain, that this can in part be explained by the pejorative idea that menstrual pains, even excruciating, debilitating menstrual pain, is a normal, natural, inevitable consequence of someone having a female reproductive system, right? It's attached to the experience, what is perceived to be the experience of a particular embodiment. Next slide. And so what I hope again to show in this talk is that when you have dismissals that have these properties, that what's really going here is not going to be an act of testimonial injustice. It's not an act or should be understood as an act of hermeneutical injustice. Instead, it's a phenomenon I can call a pain-related motivational deficit. And again, I want to give the caveat that maybe you think, well, yes, this is a form of pain dismissal, but how common is it, right? It's not as common as the drug-seeking case. It's not as common as the we think you just have anxiety case. But in fact, it isn't rare. Like I said, Alma was diagnosed with endometriosis at the age of 30. Endometriosis affects nearly 176 million individuals globally. And those who are menstruating persons can wait anywhere between 7 to 9 years to be diagnosed with endometriosis. So for those who don't know, endometriosis is when the injured tissue in the uterus exists outside the uterus. It can cause excruciating pain. One of the primary symptoms is pelvic or abdominal pain. But funny enough, those are the pain that are most likely to be dismissed, leading to the delayed diagnosis of endometriosis. In fact, this is an excellent book written by Abby Norman, Asked Me About My Uterus. She too was diagnosed with endometriosis and experienced this kind of dismissal. And so, like I said, studies have shown that once a healthcare provider kind of interprets a pain, especially in the pelvic or abdomen area, as menstrual related, they're often less motivated to consider any pathological causes, right? They're less motivated to do further diagnostic work, or in Alma's case, give anything besides some strong pills. And why should we care about menstrual pains, right? Maybe you think, again, that kind of narrative, they're normal, they're natural, they're an inevitable consequence. Well, and this is a big range. A study has shown that anywhere between 2 to 29% of persons say that menstrual pains limit their daily activity. That makes it hard to go to work, hard to go to school, hard to get out of bed. So it can be a debilitating experience independent of there being a pathological cause. So again, something that I argue ought to take seriously. So my argument here is theories of epistemic injustice are really going to only capture those cases of identity-based pain dismissals, cases in which there's prejudice against the speaker, their gender, their racial identity, any other marginalized identity that's going to cause us to question or doubt their pain experience. And even with hermeneutical injustice, a lot of the language is giving your social membership, your group membership, you can't contribute to society's sharing of knowledge and the resources we have to talk about pain. So it's still going to be an identity-based explanation there. What I hope to show is that pain-related motivational deficit are going to be able to account for cases in which, again, there's not prejudice against the speaker's social identity, but rather there's society-wide prejudice against the kinds of pains expressed. So in this talk, I'm really focusing on menstrual pains, but elsewhere I postulate that maybe, this can account for labor pain dismissal of any addiction withdrawal pains, this kind of phenomenon that's coming up of obesity pains, that pains that's just associated with heavy weight kind of gets brushing off as well. So it's not just unique to menstrual pains, but that will be the focus of today. And then second, this pain-related motivational deficit is going to be able to account for cases in which, again, we're not talking about questioning the pain testimony. We're not talking about denying that the pain exists, but instead it's going to be a deficit or lack of motivation, of concern, or some sense of alarm, but just urgency of action, right? Next slide. So again, I'm going to start off looking at kind of the limits of testimonial injustice. That's our go-to case. That's the way we love to talk about pain dismissal in the bioethics world. I'm going to unpack what I mean by pain-related motivational deficit. And when I'm talking about pain-related motivational deficit, for some people, it's going to sound a lot like hermeneutical injustice. It's going to sound a lot like I'm talking about, structures in society and ideology. How does it differ? Great question, which is why I'm going to talk about why hermeneutical injustice is also not the answer. And then lastly, look at some practical implications this can have for the clinic and for our healthcare practices. So testimonial injustice, like I mentioned, is a kind of epistemic injustice. Fricker talks about the most common form of a testimonial injustice is this identity, prejudicial credibility deficit. This occurs when prejudice on the hearer's end causes the speaker to be given less credibility than what would they otherwise have been given, right? So in layman's terms, this happens when a pain sufferer is just unfairly questioned or doubt because of their identity, because of prejudice towards that identity. I thought it would be helpful to start with a very well-documented example of what pain dismissal looks like in terms of a credibility deficit. Excellent book written by Dr. Damon Tweedy entitled Black Man in a White Coat. And so he talks about this experience he had where he went to the doctor's office for knee pain shortly after playing basketball. He still had on sweatpants, kind of a baggy t-shirt, and he goes into the doctor's office and the doctor refuses to even touch his knee. Like, doesn't really engage with him, doesn't show any prioritizing action, doesn't offer any, kind of diagnostic differentials. And then suddenly Dr. Tweedy starts to use some medical jargon, starts talking about a metacarpal tour, right? And then suddenly it clicks in the physician. And he now takes Dr. Treaty seriously. So Dr. Treaty writes, I couldn't get out of my mind how I've been treated as two entirely different patients. Damon Treaty, the unknown Black man, dressed like he was about to mow the lawn, couldn't get the doctor to look him in the eye or even touch him. Damon Treaty, MD, was worthy of personal first-class service. In fact, after he used that medical language, the physician offered to do an X-ray. That was not an option that was provided initially. So I want us to compare the case between Dr. Treaty and Alma, right? How are they similar? Well, you can argue in both cases the physicians were improperly motivated, right? When Dr. Treaty first went to the doctor's office and the doctor wouldn't even touch his knee, didn't offer an X-ray, didn't offer any treatment, that was a failure to be motivated. It was a failure to take action. So in that way, the cases are similar. You can also say in both cases, the social facts were distorted. So for Dr. Treaty, it was the distortion of what it is to be speaking as a Black man. Systematically, they're going to be perceived as less credible, less competent, arguably criminalized. In Alma's case, the social facts were unique to her pain experience. What was being distorted was the menstrual pain. No matter how bad it feels for you as the speaker, what you're sharing to me is just a normal, natural, inevitable consequence of your embodiment. And so that's important to note. Next slide. Because what I see is that the cause of the improper motivation is now different, right? So in Treaty's case, what caused the physician not to do further evaluation of the pain? A misperception and bias against Treaty's group membership. It's because you're a Black man, I don't find you credible or competent to share this information with me. That's very different than what's happening in Alma's case, from my perspective, right? Here is a case of a misperception and bias against the kind of pain being expressed. Arguably, and there's not really empirical data about this, but arguably we could say if Alma was complaining about something else, let's say a chest pain, a back pain, that it would have gotten a different response, but it's been virtue of her complaining about menstrual related pains that it wasn't leading to the motivation. So here we have a big distinction of what is causing that lack of motivation. And maybe you think, Jada, you didn't really take testimonial injustice off the table. It's just the way you're framing the case. Couldn't we say the same thing of Alma was still providing some kind of testimony, the speech at which is the goal of sharing knowledge and information, that her goal was to share information, but she was trying to share that she was experiencing a pathological pain, a pain that has a disease cause. However, because Alma lacks any medical credential, trainings, or experiences, her physicians don't trust or believe her to be a reliable or credible reporter of pathological pains. And that's what led to the lack of action. Why can't we think of the case this way? Then the similarities with Treaty seems to be on par. Before Treaty showed his MD chops, I don't believe you had the medical terminology to know that something's pathologically wrong with you. So I'm not going to respond that way. He suddenly changed the language. Oh, I do trust that you know the difference between a non-pathological and pathological pain. So why can't we think that Alma's case is the same? Well, I think to interpret Alma's experience and experiences like Alma in such a form, it wrongly assumes that when you're a pain sufferer and you're going in the clinic, that you already know that your pain is pathological in nature. And I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily feel that. I don't get that information from the pain. I feel like something is wrong, but I shouldn't be, as a pain speaker, on the hook for knowing that it's disease than cause. And that's not the way it seems we communicate in general. We're not speaking assuming that we know our pain and our experiences are disease versus non-disease. So it puts a lot of pressure and I think unfair weight onto the pain sufferer to be held accountable for knowing whether or not their pain is disease. And I don't think that's what they're communicating. So you could think, okay, let's scrap the experiencing pathological pain language and instead, next slide, replace it with something like she's attempting to provide a testimony that she's experiencing an alarming pain or concerning pain, a pain that's just bad to her, right? But again, maybe she just lacks these credentials or this epistemic expertise to know what's really bad for her. And that's why we don't see her as a reliable, credible reporter. So again, now the cases look very similar. Why do I think that's still not the right explanation for this case? Well, one slide back, thank you. It still ignores the fact that the kind of pain matters, right? And again, I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A, but I think intuitively, and again, thinking about the one source I found, that there's something about how healthcare providers are responding to gynecological or menstrual-related pains that are just different than how they respond to other kinds of pain. And so just kind of looping all the pains together under this language of alarming or bad pain, it's not giving us the tools we need to make that differentiation. And I think that differentiation is going to be very important when we see of how can we tackle this problem. So again, that's why I think calling Alma's case and cases like her testimony and justice miss our target. It doesn't provide an adequate enough explanation. And instead, I propose something like a pain-related motivational deficit. And so I define a pain-related motivational deficit as a defective uptake of the pain utterance motivational contributions or imperative content without disturbing the proper uptake of the pain utterance epistemic contributions or indicative content. I know that's a lot of fancy jargon again in theory there, and definitely going to unpack it. And so again, looking at what typically occurs when a person is unfairly assigned a pain-related motivational deficit. I'm going to say, first, the speaker has to provide a pain utterance. I'm going to say why that's important in the next slide. Second, the addressee is acknowledging the pain exists. So that's indicating that they believe the pain, is indicating that there's some kind of credibility is being assigned to the pain utterance. But yet the addressee is improperly motivated by the speaker's pain utterance. And this motivational failure is in part explained by an ideology-based distortion of the pain expressed. And the pain expressed is what I call the imperative communicative content of the pain utterance, right? It's what's part of what it is when I'm sharing my pain. So again, that's why I think highlighting that a pain utterance was provided is important. What is it that we're doing as a speech act when we share or communicate our pains with others? So in another paper I have forthcoming entitled Sharing Pain, a Hybrid Expressivist Account, I argue that sharing our pains or pain utterance is different than providing something like a weather report, right? There's something just fundamental differently of saying that my head hurts, my chest hurt versus, it's raining outside, I had a good cookie today. Those are different kind of utterances. What makes them different? Well, part of what it is that when I say my head really hurts, part of its content, part of what's being communicated is an expression of pain, right? Our language is just a more, complicated way in which we express pain, like crying or grimacing. So that's part of its function in our community. And so for that reason, I argue that statements like my head really hurts kind of have two communicative content. What it does is first, it's saying that I believe that I'm in pain. So I am still sharing a belief. So in that way, it's functioning like a testimony or like a report. I'm saying, I'm reporting that I've been subjected to a pain experience. I might share some more information like how the pain feels, where it's located. That's all epistemic contributions from my statement. But what I uniquely kind of contribute in this work is, it ignores the fundamental part of what it is that we do when we communicate our pain, which is just expressing pain. And so philosophers of minds have this view called imperativism, and it's the idea that what it is to be in pain is to be subjected to some kind of command or, imperative action guiding language. So when I touch a hot stove, it's not that through my pain, I learned that, I got damages to my hand. Not necessarily, yet it's localized, but I don't get a lot of rich information. Really what I get from touching a hot stove is information to move my hand back. I hurt my ankle, I'm told in some kind of sensory language, do not put weight on my ankle. So it's very much an imperative state. In fact, philosopher Colin Klein goes as far as to say that pain is a command, it's a body command. And so if we think that pain is some kind of command, when I say that my head hurts, when I'm providing a pain utterance, I'm really doing two things. I'm providing a testimony. I want you to get some kind of epistemic information for what I'm doing, but I'm also reissuing a command. I'm trying to get you to do something with some kind of motivational force, right? And so I think that's a really important function of pain utterances that kind of get left out of the literature. And so for that reason, now when we talk about this language of uptake, what does it mean to recognize what we're doing with language? Because it has two components, two uptakes are required. We have to take in the epistemic contribution, we have to take in the knowledge that's being shared, and then we also have to take in the motivational contribution. We have to take in what is it about pain that's this inherently motivating state, this command feel-like state, and get that from the language. So when we have a pain-related motivational deficit, what's happening is that uptake is given to the epistemic contribution. And this is very different from the cases that we've already talked about. The cases in which, the person's pain is doubted, we deny that the pain is real. Sometimes we just ignore the pain. We call it anxiety, hysteria, right? Those are moments in which we're not accepting the information. How do we know? Because again, the pain is not acknowledged. There's no response that's indicating that we truly believe the pain exists. But next slide. In cases of a pain-related motivational deficit, the pain is acknowledged, right? Think about the language that Alma received. It's just a painful period. They didn't say it's just anxiety. They said it's pain. But because that language of just, it indicates that the motivational import has been downgraded. Don't believe me? Think about all the times we put just in front of something. It's just an ant. They're just a friend, right? It's lowering the significance of what that thing serves in our lives, right? So to say that it's just a painful period is to acknowledge that that state exists, but it's not really significant, right? It doesn't have that motivational import. And that explains why the addressee of the pain utterance is now improperly motivated. So again, the addressee acknowledges and believes the speaker's in pain, but this communicated pain is misinterpreted as, it's not that bad, it's not that concerning, no need to be alarmed. And so to rely a bit on philosophy of language and some speech act theories, I think this can be explained with this concept that Kukla introduces called an uptake distortion, right? And so again, but looking only at what's happening for the imperative content, what's happening for the pain being expressed. And so uptake distortion occurs when a person's trying to do something with language and it's kind of given less force than what they intended to. And so an example they often utilize is a woman who's a factory manager is trying to tell her predominantly male factory workers what to do. And so she intends to be issuing orders. Because she speaks as a woman, they kind of interpret as just a request, right? She's just asking me to do something. And so even though an order and a request are both imperatives, they're both trying to get you to do action, the force is different, right? In order, it's prioritized, it's an obligation, you have to do it based off my authority. A request, according to Kukla, is something we're free to do, right? We have the option to follow it. And that's a significantly different normative output. So then what's happening with pain utterances in this case is that the uptake given by the addressee distorts the pain utterance, again, from this language of command of what we feel pain to be is this felt command. Sorry, I hit the mic. This like prioritized obligation to take action, to be alarmed, to be concerned. And instead it distorts into this deprioritized, non-obligatory kind of request-like thing. And why does this happen? Well, in our society, our social logic is such that any pains that's interpreted as natural or normal, we have no alarm. We're not concerned by it, right? And so an example I often think of, I do not like going to the gym. When I go to the gym, you're asking me to lift weights. I'm like, ow, my arms. I tell the trainer, oh, my arms hurt, right? The trainer says, keep going. It's dismissive of me. But do we find that problematic? Did he somehow do a communicative wrong? No, because in our society, we have this habit, this social habit of treating any normal and inevitable consequence of working out, these like little pains, as fine, right? We don't have to take that as seriously. As the idiom says, no pain, no gain, right? Not only do we not take it seriously, in some way, it's even expected. Am I really working out if it doesn't hurt, right? So in that way, this dismissive doesn't seem to be some kind of wrongdoing on the part of the trainer. It's actually just part of our natural everyday behavior. It would be kind of counterproductive if every time I said, ow, the trainer said, stop. Okay, stop. We would get nowhere, right? But when it comes to menstrual pains, we have to question the source of why do we fit them under this category of normal pains, no matter how bad they are, right? So we're really talking about these excruciating ones get captured under this concept of normal pains as well. And so the last condition that I think fits this narrative of a pain-related motivational deficit is that part of what's doing the work is these ideological system-wide distortions. And I want to be careful about this because the idea of a motivational deficit, a failure to just be motivated by something that you should otherwise be motivated by, can happen for a number of reasons, right? So it can happen due to innocent error, especially, clinical judgment is fallible, just like human judgment. It could be a case where, a doctor's working with a patient with Crohn's disease, has seen 1,000 cases of Crohn's disease. Here comes the 1,001. It's like, give me opioids. I'm in pain. I'm miserable. The clinician does the kind of, clinical judgment mathematics and say, oh, the likelihood that the pain is that bad is really low. I'm able to not take it as seriously. Maybe they still get it wrong, but that's a case of innocent error, right? Another case I don't want to fit in this definition that I think can be excluded is the times where you're failed to be motivated by others' pains, but it's due to just limited attentional and motivational capacities. So what do I mean by that? The cases of an overworked nurse. You're in the ER, you have 30 patients. There's an interesting publication in the Atlantic talking about this, of a mixed case of ovarian torsion, which is quite painful experience. And the nurse there in that emergency room, they had beds lined up the hall. There were other people who were also experiencing pain. And the person report, my pain is like 11 out of 10, it's significant. And the nurse responds, take your turn, like wait your turn, right? So very dismissive, but let's think about the place that the nurse was in. There's already 10 other beds present, right? In your mind, you're doing the quick calculations. Oh, they're complaining about pelvic pains. I got someone here with a gunshot. I literally just don't have any more cares to give, especially in our society. In our society where nurses are also understaffed. And maybe you have other administrative obligations as a healthcare provider. So sometimes we fail to be motivated when we ought to be, just because, again, we just don't have enough cares to give. We are only human. I want to leave space for those. I don't think that's some kind of communicative wrongdoing. But what I think happens when it is a wrongdoing, when it becomes some kind of injustice, is if these motivational deficits can be explained by a widely held, ill-formed, symbol, narrative, idea, fit your category there, about the experiences of a particular embodiment. Right. So ideology, philosophers are always debating, how are we defining ideology? I'm leaving that kind of open, which is why I'm like any kind of symbol, narrative, idea, social practice that kind of contributes this distorted picture. And so an example, I think, of a motivational deficit that can be traced to these kind of problematic ideological practices is the case of Black women and fibroids. So again, I try to use a lot of real stories because, why make up something where these are real people's experiences? So this was a person narrative that was shared in a health.com article. Women of color die of cancer at higher rates than white women. And the person who was speaking was Adrian. For 9 months, Adrian complained of inconsistent periods and excruciating pelvic pain. At one doctor's visit, Adrian, in reference to her pelvic pain, says, it still hurts. Adrian's worried that the pain may be a sign that something is wrong. Otherwise, Adrian is alarmed. It's responding to her own pain with alarm and concern. The doctor shrugs Adrian off and says, you're a Black woman, you get fibroids. Right? So what's happening in that case? Again, not denying that Adrian is in pain, right? It's acknowledging that this is a painful period, not necessarily seeing her as uncredible, but it's not really taking her seriously in an actional capacity and motivational capacity, because this narrative that exists that fibroids are just a Black woman's problem. They do occur in higher rates in Black women, but you see that's a different line of reasoning than this is a normal experience and an inevitable consequence of your particular embodiment. And so because it's taking that extra line that this is normal for your embodiment, it's now being followed with that social logic of, I don't have to be alarmed. I don't have to take this seriously. And then what's the harm of this? Well, Adrian wasn't, by the time she got diagnosed with endometrial cancer, she was at stage 3, right? So this delayed diagnosis of not taking certain pain experiences seriously. And so again, let's look at how did this idea that menstrual pains, no matter how excruciating, no matter how debilitating, are just a normal, natural, and inevitable consequence of having a female reproductive system. Where did this idea come from? Yes, there's some truth to it, but when we look at the medical literature, another excellent book by Eleanor Cleghorn, Unwell Women, Misdiagnosis and Myth in the Man-Made World, the idea that menstrual pains are inherently debilitating, inherently significantly painful, can be traced to the 19th century, where doctors who did publish papers on this hand-selected and explored a few cases of menstruating persons, ones who happened to actually have pathological causes to their menstrual pains. They handpicked those cases. And as a result, when these articles were coming out, this idea that periods are a disability and suffering was so ingrained that those who were experiencing period pains as not debilitating were actually finding themselves to feel abnormal, that I'm not the normal case, that this is supposed to be something that keeps me bedridden in the bed. And why this is a problematic picture is because when you look at how do we diagnose conditions like endometriosis, one of the defining features are, again, chronic menstrual pains that are debilitating. If we take that and it's captured in our language of normal, how do we get people to buy into the fact that this is actually something that should signal that it's pathological, right? So that's where I kind of look at, yes, the picture has some truth to it, but we must question how it was formed and how widely it has shaped our society. And so because I'm talking about, social things in the social imagination, narratives, you may think, well, this just sounds like a case of hermeneutical injustice. Miranda Fricker talks about hermeneutical injustice as occurring when the intelligibility of a particular social experience is constrained or undermined due to a conceptual impoverishment at the level of the entire culture, right? So when we just don't have the language or conceptual resources to talk about certain experiences. And the case she talks about is of Camellia Woods, who experienced sexual harassment, but at a time where sexual harassment wasn't a concept, right? So that's an example of a hermeneutical injustice. But she specifically, in talking about hermeneutical injustice, talks about it as some kind of conceptual or language gap. So she talks about it where there's a gap in the collective interpretive resources caused by unequal hermeneutical participation by the already marginalized, right? So who, based on your social identity, is allowed to contribute to knowledge, who's allowed to share of concepts in the languages that we use. And so if you're in a marginalized or hermeneutical marginalized community, you don't get to contribute the languages in the same equal way, which is why sexual harassment as a concept took so long to get uptake in our society. So maybe you think this is what's happening with menstrual pains, that yes, it's not linked to individual identity prejudice, but maybe as a society, we just don't have the language or conceptual resources to make sense of menstrual pains, right? They're hard, the intelligibility is hard to understand. And maybe you think that it's menstruating persons who are hermeneutically marginalized, right? They're restricted from being able to contribute into this work, especially in the medical field. I see such an explanation, but again, I find it quite limiting because if you think about it, it's not that we don't have language for menstrual pains. In fact, what I'm hoping to show is that we do have language. It's just a harmful one, right? We do have a shared interpretive resource, that these menstrual pains, even bad, are just normal and natural. Many patients even talk about internalizing that narrative where they don't go seek help because it's like, oh, my mom went through it. This is just how it's supposed to be. This is what it means to have this reproductive system, right? So it seems we do have the language, which is why Irina Falbo recently published a journal article that I thought made a very helpful distinction. She says that Fricker talks a lot about a negative hermeneutical injustice, but we also have cases of a positive hermeneutical injustice. And this occurs when we do have language, but the application of that language is prevented due to the presence of oppressive or distorting concepts. And so, apologize, trigger warning, the concepts that she looks at is trying to apply the language of rapist to someone who meets the golden boy image, right? The, American hero, the football player, that we don't see rapists as fitting that narrative due to a lot of kind of racialized in our society. Instead, we often see a Black man, a man of color, some big kind of monster in our mind. So it's not that we don't have the language of rapists available, but when we try to apply it to someone who's different from this narrative that we have in our mind, it doesn't seem to fit. It's prevented. So again, yeah, a speaker can't apply a concept in certain instances because of this idea of a hermeneutical defeat. So maybe you think same thing's happening in this case, that we do have these concepts of alarming pains, of concerning pains, of bad pains, and that the way our society is worked, that menstruating persons are prevented from being able to apply that concept to their menstrual related pains, right? That I can't say that a menstrual or pelvic pain is alarming or concerning in a way that makes sense to the healthcare provider, in a way that makes sense to my addressee. I do like this solution because it does consider, a distortion of what is being communicated, which I think is important. We always talk about identities, but not talking about prejudice of what it is that we're talking about. But I think it's important that we make a distinction between intelligibility or making sense of something, of a cognitive understanding, from appreciating something, right? I think that's a very important distinction. So when we talk about intelligibility, and that's what epistemic injustice is all about, right? The wronging of someone in this epistemic realm. We're talking about making sense of, getting some cognitive understanding of, forming beliefs. And often that is going to rely on language like credibility, competence, expertise, trust. But I think that's different from a language of like appreciation. So I can believe that you're in pain, but not appreciate your pain. And so their appreciation is going to look like a value judgment, right? Recognizing, and I've said this word a couple of times, the import of the situation. And so import is a language that I adopted from Bennett Helm. He's an evaluativist in the pain literature. So he believes that pain is this kind of motivational appraisal. It is this kind of judgment. It is saying something bad is happening here. And he says, when we think of something as having import, it's to be a worthy object of attention and action, insofar as something has import for one ought to pay attention to it, and so be prepared to act on its behalf when otherwise appropriate. And so it's important because although understanding something often leads to appreciation, the two can come apart. There are times where I can understand something and still not find it an object worthy of attention and action, which again seems to be the case with Alma. They understood that she was having menstrual pain, but like she said in her own language, they didn't see it as something worthy of treatment. All right, next slide. And so for those who are interested in the Q&A, I do consider other kind of theories that's related to communication. So I was looking here only at epistemic injustice. Other things that have been proposed is discursive injustice, again, some work by Kukla. And so that's looking at how do we communicatively wrong each other. And there I'm going to say they're still providing an identity-based account, looking at the identity of the speaker, not necessarily what's being communicated. I also consider illocutionary silencing. So again, it's a communicative wrong in nature of, what it is that we're doing with language. Their account always applies to the entire utterance. And what I'm doing is looking at how we can have uptake of one part and dismissive of the other part. So I think it's still a limiting view. And very quickly, implications. Why am I doing all this work, right? Why am I being so picky about how are we interpreting these cases? Well, if we do not finally define each barrier to effective pain communication, we risk proposing solutions that only partially address the problem of pain dismissal. And so I think some implications, if you buy my view of pain-related motivational deficit, if you see it as a problem in our society, some ways we can respond is now talk about having diagnosis-based implicit bias training, right? So in the healthcare field, we're always talking about implicit bias training when it comes to a person's identity. But what is it to have implicit bias training about particular diagnosis, right? So again, start addressing prejudice that a healthcare provider or a healthcare system can have towards certain pain experiences or diagnoses. I talk about menstrual pains here, but I think, again, this can apply to labor pains, obesity-related pains, addiction withdrawal pains. If others have other examples, I'm always open to learning more. And I think another implication that this work can have is change in our research and medical school curricula. So a paper came out in 2011, and in one line it says, only 0.1% of all pain papers even talk about menstrual pains, despite arguably half of our society experiencing them, right? So there's very little research going into this, again, showing a difference between a prejudice against an experience versus the identities. So there's very little research going into menstrual pains. And they're not really being kind of talked about in the medical school curricula. And if they are, it's a very narrative, normal, natural experience until something goes wrong. So embracing a more pluralistic picture of menstrual pains in our medical practices. How do many people experience this? Even again, if nothing pathologically is wrong, if it's excruciating to a certain class of individuals, what's the explanation? How can we respond to it in a more inclusive and meaningful way? So in conclusion, I hope to show that there is a difference between a failure to motivate and a failure to share knowledge. The unfair disadvantage with respect to one's ability to motivate care, concern, alarm with one's pain utterance dissociates and is distinct from what we typically think of epistemic injustice, the unfair disadvantage with respect to one's state as an epistemic subject. These are just some of my references because I want to make sure you could see some if people wanted it. And thank you for your time. I'll open the floor to questions. Am I in charge of Q&A?
Yeah, no, sorry.
Oh, okay, don't worry.
I'm very happy to let Jada, your fun event Q&A. That's
No, please speak. Yeah.
Hi, Jada, it's really great to see you.
Great to see you, yeah.
Paper, and I'm convinced, that this case and the type of case you're talking about is not hermeneutical or testimonial injustice.
ready to start this.
Okay. Big thank you to Jada. I'm convinced that it's not hermeneutical or testimonial justice, that we need something else to capture it. And maybe you didn't mean this line to be quite so sharp, at least in the case of menstrual pain. It does seem like we still have to talk about it. Yes, in terms of the diagnosis, but it does to me seem still so connected to identity.
Yeah.
That and frankly, the thing I kept thinking about, like, why do we dismiss this pain? I kept thinking of the religious explanation, which is culturally religious, maybe not as much practicing religious, maybe both. It's Eve.
Yeah.
Eve is
Yeah.
the problem, and she was cursed by God as a result. And so you will bear children in pain from here on after. So anything connected with our reproductive stuff is part of a just punishment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to speak, I'm air quoting here. I'm saying right now, air quoting that, and I meant just in the others.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not just punishment, it is a just punishment.
A good, yeah.
And so of course you expect that. And so and so the doctor's cases from the 19th century were interesting too, but like, I think it goes back deeper in our culture about, yeah, the women's stuff, it's sucks being you're a woman, but that's kind of how it's supposed to be. Yeah. And so I don't know how you change the training around that, but it does to me seem connected to an identity, but that's not the way to object to your setting up this different category that's diagnosis.
No, thank you. I'm happy you brought that up. Because it is something so this is a combination of like 2.5 chapters in my dissertation that I try to go in a bit more detail with in the actual project. And so for your point, I hear two things. One, that doesn't it still seem to be in identity at the end of the day, or at least under root, which I agree. Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, we don't want to collapse it into. Mhm.
I just didn't want identity to drop out.
Yeah.
Sharp line there that we're not talking about sometimes.
Yes, helpful. 'Cause I think the way I'm trying to still capture it, but draw that line is by talking about embodiment identity. And so in the dissertation, I have this area where I distinguish embodiment identity from speaker identity, because I think sometimes they come together and sometimes they come apart, right? And so a case I look at is let's talk if we were talking about labor pains. And let's say, cisgender husband, who arguably in our society has the credibility, comes in and says, my wife's labor pain, she's miserable. And the doctor says, of course she's in pain, she just had a baby, right? There, it seems that it's not the speaker's identity, of course, that's doing the work. But to your point, identity is still part of the picture, but it's the embodiment identity in which that pain experience is associated with. And so I could be a little clearer about that here in the slide. So I do want to say it's an identity, but it's the embodied identity that the pain experiences are associated with that comes apart from just prejudice against the identity of the speaker. Because often it's hard, because often in our society, the two are conflated. And so it's hard for us to see those distinctions. But I do want identity to still be on the table, but to talk about it in a way of something associated with the embodiment of a marginalized identity. So I put a little bit less emphasis on identity for that reason. The second thing you said that I wanted to highlight that I didn't get to do in this presentation, I do talk about religion and desert as well. So I think that there's two social logics that exist. What I call the embodiment pain logic, which is, this is just a normal experience for you. Why should I care? The Black women in fibroid case. And then I talk about a desert logic of, you did something wrong, even historically, and therefore this is a just punishment for you. And if you deserve something, I'm also not moved forward concern. And there's actually like neuroscience research about this, of people who watch pain inflicted, oh no, they can see me, pain inflicted on those who have been unfair to the person. The affective parts of our brain don't respond in the same way, because we see it as deserving. So in that case, I really actually look at more the obesity related pains for that explanation, but it was a helpful reminder that maybe this is under with the menstrual pain too, and that it's even hard to pull those two apart. Yeah. Thank you.
Substance is not treating that pain as similar to this. You kind of hit that slightly with different topics, but we'd like to know before that. But I also wanted to say, that one change would be, I went as an artist, I went to something, we had period parties, where we bring period products and make, like, and talk about their period experience and talk, and that was so radical. We've not been able to talk about these things in period. Because it was things, well, I remember when we had to hide, you know, when we went to the grocery store, you were like, you better, so we're all, don't you know what? You know, I mean, so the whole marriage policy is completely shameless.
Yeah.
And therefore they can't speak hard about what they need, because it's like, oh God, I mean, this is about security. You know, so that seems to fit in.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And I think it's just further justification why it's important to look at the kinds of pains independent from the speaker. Because to your point, certain experiences are stigmatized and we just can't talk about them. And one of the big ones are menstrual pains, pelvic-related pains. And that stigma exists in a way that, again, I don't think it's associated with back pain. I think I hear people complain, I'm still quite young, but even I start to feel a little bit of back pain and I'm happy to talk about that, right? Headaches, we're a lot more open to talk about. But I think to your point is the silencing of particular pain experiences contribute to the failure to be motivated, because it's now an idea of it's not worthy of alarm, worthy of concern, not worthy of discussion, not worthy to be seen. And again, I think all that's still different from epistemic work that's happening. And then to your first point, the addiction withdrawal case, I kind of put that also, the reason I just hinted to it, because I'm still grappling with what I want to do with that case. My knee-jerk reaction is that it's similar to the dessert pain narrative, that you brought this on to yourself, and therefore I don't have to respond to alarm and concern. And I think, again, the idea of how ideology or pejorative ill-formed sources contribute is, as we know, a lot of what addiction does is a biological change. But because we still have, and to the other point is, I think religion had a great influence in medicine. And I get a lot of pushback about this because I had it in a lot of it in my dissertation, and kind of changed the language a little bit. Because people see us as not, especially healthcare practices, is not as religious as it used to be, but the source is still there of there's certain, the 10 deadly sins. Gluttony is one of them, which kind of gets us in the camp of obesity. So it could also get us in the camp of overindulgence and things that cause pleasure, and getting this idea of addiction off the ground and running. And so now, even though we're removed from our roots, this whole idea of you brought this upon yourself, pain is a punishment that's appropriate and fitting, giving is an inevitable consequence of this action, I think is still there. But I say all to say is I agree. That's my knee-jerk thought of how addiction falls into play, not as much an embodiment and more of an inevitable consequence of behaviors, and the ways our society values and defines certain behaviors. But I still need to do a lot more work in that realm.
Questions?
Yes. Yeah, so there's a question on Zoom, and you may have to repeat it. There's some microphone issues,
Okay.
but they wonder if you're familiar with Alison Patsava from Disability Studies, and the construct is epistemology of pain, and that sounds apparently a lot like epistemic injustice.
Sorry, repeat the first.
So yeah, it's Alison Patsava's construct of the epistemology of pain, and they were wondering if you knew about that, or if it applied.
I know of the philosopher, but not necessarily of that work. I'll own up to it. So I would say I'll save the chat to make sure I look into that. So if they want to say more about what they think the relationship is or anything, I'll definitely take a look at it. But I can honestly say I haven't read the work, but I'm familiar with who Alison is. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think we have probably time for one more question. Is that right?
Hi, thank you so much again. Wonderful presentation. Something that came up in my mind while you were presenting that I wonder how you would parse this, because working through it in my head, there seem to be some interesting differences. Is the standard practice of not applying anesthesia when putting in IUDs?
Intro of my dissertation.
Oh, right.
Yep. Yeah. As I guess I have a repeating case, the Zoom folks in here. So the question on the table was, how would I classify or discuss the implantation of IUDs and the lack of anesthesia as a common standard practice. And so I just discovered of this as I was working on my dissertation close to the end, because I kind of did the introduction last, as you know, as the practice is. And so, yeah, I found it very interesting that, again, I think now I'm leaning towards expanding the criteria, not just from, because I keep menstrual pains and labor pains distinctive. And I think maybe what's really the source is gynecologically related pains. But then that gets me very close into the whole of, well, isn't this just identity at the end of the day? Well, it's doing a lot of the work historically. And I think, yes, it is. But I think it's still important to have this conversation, because I don't know, oh, my slides are gone. The first picture on my slides, I actually got from a New York Times article, don't know if people are aware of, that came out a couple of weeks ago, that women at Yale who were getting egg retrieval, the nurse had took the fentanyl, and they were complaining about the pains. And, you know, the doctors were saying, we gave as much pain as we can. But even again, they were internalizing this message of maybe it's just supposed to hurt. Like, it's just what this is supposed to be. And so in that case, there's at least a standard practice of giving pain medication. But with the IUD case, a lot of the language that healthcare providers are responding to patients with, don't worry, it's just a bit of discomfort. So again, some acknowledgement that it's painful, but not significant. It's just discomfort. And I think it goes back to what research we need to do. Because I think I've only found, again, I'm new to this topic, I only found one research paper that did show with IUDs, the pain is different of whether or not you had a child before the IUD. But it still seem to be any push of, why can't we give this anesthesia? And maybe you would think the narrative is, oh, you know, it's an elective process. It's not that pathological. You know, we're adding more harm than good because of the, you know, risk of anesthesia. But how many other elective processes do we have where anesthesia is involved? Wow. And so then it's like, it can't just be, it's an elective. It seems to be, there's something related to gynecology in the female reproductive system that we was like, you can handle it. This is meant for your embodiment, like your body can take it. But so I say that it's an example I'm definitely thinking on. I have another talk coming up that's more for a clinical audience. And I want to try to be a lot more thoughtful of what are these kind of clinical examples to show that it's not just I feel like menstrual pains, even people are still like, even when I give some talks, sometimes people are like, is menstrual pains really that big of an example? Which I'm like, well, you kind of just proved my point. But also I think like really looking at how vast of a problem it is that we're dismissive of gynecological pelvic kind of pain experiences. And so thank you, as I keep thinking more about other cases beyond menstrual label, IUD, egg retrieval. Unfortunately, the list can go on. Thank you.
All right, sorry, so they're gonna run us out of the room relatively soon, but I wanted to thank Jada for this talk. Thank you. Thank everybody who joined us online.